Chris is just trying to pin one of the BSL ASL interpreters. Ah, Robert's back. Fantastic.
Mine was so accurate.
Can you see the BSL interpreter? Can you see the BSL interpreter?
Yes, I am ready.
Here. Everyone's fine. We're good. Everyone good?
Just double checking.
Good, good.
Yes. Yep, all good.
Good, good. Great. Hey, all right. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My students. So Zoom, I don't know much about it. I'm not very good at it. I just can't figure it out. It's almost an impossibility. Just like we're recording, right? Just want to confirm we're recording the session. Okay, awesome. You've thought of everything. Thank you so much. Relieving to me. All right, very good. So I keep forgetting things. Things are added, things keep going, but again, here we are. All right, well, welcome once again. My name is Francis Conlon. Francis. Nice to see all of you here. So this is a DeafSpace architectural panel. So I've got my students here. It's a students project. In the past, last February, my students, Emmett and Madison, they're architecture majors. And they're thinking about what to do, wanting to do something connected to deaf architecture. And I said, well, why don't we have some conversations, and it came up with a few ideas, and here we are. Wonderful. We're glad you're here today. Okay, so everything's set up here. Emmett and Madison, they'll be facilitating and running the show. But I want to welcome 3 of our panelists who are with us today. We have Alexa Vaughn. She's from Los Angeles, working for MIG. So we also have Jeff Mansfield here in the room with us. And Jeff Mansfield works for Mass Design Group in Boston. And thirdly, we have Chris Laing. Chris works for Haworth Tompkins in London, England. Very cool. We have we have various time zones all over the place here tonight. So right now, I think in LA it's 3 p.m. Here it's 6 p.m. Eastern, and in London it is 11 p.m. in the evening. Well, very cool. So a whole variety of time zones going on. All right. We also have 3 languages happening at the same time tonight. Obviously, we have American Sign Language, we have British Sign Language, and we have English. So just checking in, it seems that the interpreters have worked things out. But again, I asked for some patience, making sure that everybody is able to have time to catch up and stay on top of this without proceeding too quickly. Okay. So what we'll do right now is, for the first half hour, Madison and Emmett, they will be leading the questions from the students. Then we will open this up for the audience via Zoom or in the room or in person as well. Okay. Well, enjoy yourselves. Again, I'll see y'all later. Thank you so much.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Emmett Solomon.
There's an echo on the line. Can we fix that?
I noticed. It's not all good now. Does this work? I feel like there's still some echo. Wow. Sorry?
I don't hear you at all. Just to let you know, I don't hear anything right now. I don't hear anything in the room. FYI.
Can you hear me now?
Hear you now. Yep, no echo.
All right. Sorry about that. Technology is very difficult. My name is Emmett Solomon. I am a sophomore here at Yale College and perspective architecture major. I am in my second semester of studying ASL here at Yale, which is why we are blessed to have so many interpreters who are going to sign these things far faster than I would. But I very much enjoyed my studies in ASL thus far, and I'm thrilled to have so many wonderful panelists here to speak with us today. I am joined by my friend and peer here, Madison.
Hi, my name is Madison Reynolds. I'm a first year at Yale College, and I'm an architecture major as well. I'm in my second semester at ASL, and I'm so happy you guys could be here today.
So I will say a bit more about our panelists, just so that everyone knows of the pedigree that we're dealing with, which I will say is quite astounding for a student project. And so we're tremendously grateful to have you all. And then we'll get into questions. So starting first with Jeffrey Mansfield. Jeff Mansfield is a principal at Mass Design Group. He leads the firm.
Oh, I'm sorry, the audio stopped working.
Yes, better?
It's on now. Yeah.
Perfect. Sorry about that. All right. What was the last thing? What was the last thing people?
Jeffrey Mansfield from Mass Design Group. Then it cut off.
Well, he is from Mass Design Group. He leads the firm's DeafSpace and Disability Justice Lab, conceived to uplift the lived experience of deaf and disabled communities in the content of architecture. Excuse me, in the context of architecture. Jeff studied architecture at Princeton University and at Harvard University, and is the recipient of fellowships for both the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and at the Library of Congress. Jeff's research explores the formation of deaf and disability spaces as expressions of cultural resistance in the 19th and 20th centuries. And his work has been published in Cooper Hewitt Design Journal, AD, and Tacit, and has been presented at MoMA PS1, Bergen Assembly, and the Sao Paulo Biennale. He joins us here in Lucy Hall in New Haven. Mr. Jeff Mansfield, thank you so much for joining us. Truly.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here, to come to Yale, and great to see everyone here in the audience. I will turn my camera here so that Chris and Alexa can also see who's here in the room with us today.
Now, for what it's worth, there are plenty more people on Zoom, but yes, we've got a small but mighty crowd here in Lucy Hall, which we're thrilled for, and I think we'll be getting questions from them a little later. Now, to move on, just so we don't get too far behind schedule, we are also joined by Ms. Alexa Vaughn. She is a landscape designer and accessibility specialist at MIT. Alexa holds 2 architecture degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. And prior to working at MIT, worked at Olin, during which time she was also named the 2020 Landscape Architecture Foundation Olmsted Fellow. In her work, Alexa seeks to center deaf and disabled stakeholders and experts' lived experiences, ensuring that they fully participate in the design process. Alexa's work has been published twice in Ground Up Journal, and she has written for the ASLA's The Dirt and has advised the ASLA Universal Design Guide. Her DeafScape work has also been featured in several articles, including Arch Daily, Curve, and Elle Decor, and she continues to research and lecture widely about designing with deaf and disabled people in mind. Zooming in from Los Angeles, please welcome Alexa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Mr. Christopher Laing. He's an architectural assistant at Haworth Tompkins before joining HT in 2017. Chris studied architecture at the University for Creative Arts and at Kingston University. He received his MA at the Royal College of Art, where his thesis was nominated for the Spatial Justice Award. Chris's research includes DeafSpace and how to build bridges between deafness and architecture, and has had success in competition, including notably at the AIA UK Student Design Charrette competition in 2014, where his team received 3rd place. Chris is also the co-founder of SignStrokes, an online facility that informs BSL interpreters and deaf users of BSL about architectural terms to make architecture more accessible for the deaf community. Joining us via Zoom, as mentioned previously, all the way from London, we are thrilled to welcome Chris Laing. And please give a warm welcome one more time to all of our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Okay, to shift gears now, we would love to begin asking questions. We first have some personal questions of our own that we're going to ask, and then we'll move on to student questions. So the first question is, this is a personal question of mine. I spent a majority of this year researching DeafSpace for my project last semester and this semester. Not only did I learn about the true exclusivity of architecture, but I learned about the limitations of language when it comes to architecture terms, which just creates an additional barrier. A project that was created by Chris was called SignStrokes, which informs BSL interpreters and deaf users of BSL architectural terms. To Chris, was there a specific event that motivated you to create this project? And to our other panelists, have there been a time where you have found a disconnect between architecture and language?
Yes, okay, so I will respond initially. So the reasoning behind setting up SignStrokes. BSL, obviously for native BSL users, means that we also struggle accessing English. So accessing jargon every day in the architectural industry is always a struggle. Of course, for hearing people, they have access to incidental learning of such terms, and in that sense, have access to more information. Now, what we realised for architectural jargon, there is no standardised terminology, there is no standardised BSL terminology, should I say, no vocabulary that has been established. So a friend of mine and I decided that actually we need to be the people to establish those signs. And deaf people don't tend to know this jargon because there's no access to it within the UK. And there is a very small pool of interpreters who are able to also understand architectural jargon. So when I've gone across to lectures, I've really not had any access to what this terminology actually means. Interpreters are actually having to fingerspell because they don't understand these terms themselves, having not been educated in architecture. Now, when I'm signing and I want to use a particular term, so for example, if I was to sign atrium, and this is what I would sign for atrium in BSL, the interpreter doesn't know what I mean. So what they will say is, oh, light coming through a roof. And I'm like, no. You're undermining my language. I want to use the term of atrium. That's what's important here. So ideally with SignStrokes, the aim is to make sure that we establish a common ground architectural vocabulary in British Sign Language that everybody can use for both deaf people and interpreters alike. So what we have on SignStrokes is a visual video, but we also have an English definition as well. So it means that the jargon itself becomes much more accessible and deaf people have an opportunity to learn what the jargon actually means, which will hopefully be further beneficial to further students, to architects, and other deaf people. Now, we were quite lucky because we were able to get funding for our project from the university, but also we were able to bring in a BSL linguist. So it meant that we were able so far to create 100 BSL terms. Obviously, we need to continue to grow that, but that's where we are at the moment. But it just means that we're building that confidence in the industry for other deaf professionals in the future.
Jeffrey here. Jeffrey here. I would just like to piggyback onto that, if you don't mind. I think what Chris is actually speaking to is very powerful. Architecture is an inaccessible profession inherently. If you think about it, deaf people are truly visual individuals using sign language, it being a visual and spatial language. At the same time, architectural as a practice and profession is inaccessible to our community, even though we have a lot of visual know-how and knowledge and where we can contribute professionally. So what Chris is doing is creating additional access to a profession that could bring some deaf community members and their inherent knowledge to the design process, that engagement, that it's so deeply powerful, and it impacts the work long term. And I just have to applaud. And again, how important the work that Chris is doing here is amazing. Kudos.
Thank you very much.
This is Alexa speaking. Today I'm going to be using my voice today because I'm actually late deafened and I just started learning sign language about 4 years ago. But I just wanted to second everything that Jeff and Chris have said, because when I started learning American Sign Language, there wasn't really a sign that I knew for landscape architecture, even. Like, I didn't have a word to describe what that meant. And the first person I asked gave me a sign that was more in line with like mow the lawn, like almost like maintenance. And like, I was like, that's not right. And so I asked a few friends that happened to be in design, and they told me they use a landscape, and it just has so much more feeling. And so I think the same is true for any type of design profession. We need to start to build that vocabulary and, getting the word out there to deaf and disabled students in a way that is meaningful to them and that they can connect to.
Well, thank you guys for your answers. They were all amazing. Thank you to Chris again for your work and for being such a pioneer. And thank you to Jeff and Alexa for your amazing responses as well. On to our next question. A positive gain caused by implementing DeafSpace architecture is not just making the architecture physically accessible, but also creating a space where deaf people feel empowered and included. A very interesting piece that Jeff did with Architectural Digest speaks very well to this. Jeff talks about how at an early age he took note of each space he occupied and how it made him feel, and how now he's teaching hearing architects to do some of the same things deaf architects may do instinctively. To Jeff, any other panelists can of course chime in. Do you at times feel an exhaustion from having to educate other architects at times on things you can and things they cannot understand as a hearing person? If so, how do you combat this exhaustion and continue to be advocates you are for the deaf community?
Jeff, events like tonight. Events like tonight are inspiring because, a bunch of us deaf designers who are not, we're not explaining to anybody who doesn't have experience, right? These are shared experiences, shared knowledge that we have all had. I think it's a nice break from the routine. Again, educating can be exhausting, but at the same time, it's something that's inherent in us as deaf people, as disabled people. We are born activists. We are born designers. We have to continue to actively advocate for ourselves and build environments that better fit our needs. So educating is one piece of that, definitely. But I also think it's important to ensure that we are creating spaces for other deaf designers or other deaf youth who are curious about the design profession and making that pipeline a possibility for new growth, new skills from the deaf community, the disabled community, to have an area in this profession. So I think, that's what invigorates me the most. How do we continue to, build that infrastructure up? Alexa says, I agree.
Thank you guys so much for those answers. We really appreciate it. And it's the education, we are so glad that you're able to come here and help us better understand and also help your peers and just create overall more inclusive case. So on to our next question. Alexa actually sent us some of her pieces, which we so greatly appreciate. So Alexa, you wrote an article in 2018 with Ground Up. I read it and it was phenomenal. Last semester, my project was on DeafSpace. It was, as you talked about in the piece, it was primarily on architectural interior designs that benefited the deaf community, but not so much the landscape in the exterior design. So you talk about DeafScape, which talks about more so urban landscape. I'm wondering what your process was for improving the guidelines to fit exterior design into DeafSpace, and for other panelists, were there times when you had to go against guidelines or have no guidelines at all to help them pioneer in certain designs?
Definitely. So I actually took a look at the whole DeafSpace design guideline set. That was it's a working draft. It's been a working draft for about 10 years now, unfortunately, but I read through it and I basically just kind of picked out different principles that I felt were really relevant to the landscape architectural perspective. And when I did that, though, I realized that so many of the principles really are relevant to any type of design, whether it be like a product in some cases, all the way to, the city as a whole, or even planning. And I think really for me, as far as the process is concerned, it came down to, I wanted to see how I could sort of tie my identity more into DeafSpace, more so from my perspective as a landscape designer, just because, as we mentioned, Jeff and Chris also mentioned that, there are a lot of us out there, but we're kind of spread out, right? And so I haven't had a chance to really meet any other deaf landscape architects just yet, but I have met a few deaf architects or deaf city planners or deaf policymakers, right? And so I was like, well, how do I kind of fit into this equation? And so that was really just using my own personal lens to sort of figure out how I can start to apply this to the broader scale of landscape architecture. And for me, I actually started as an architecture major. When I went to UC Berkeley, they have a BA program in architecture. And when I first got there, I didn't even know what landscape architecture was. And so when I started to discover what it was, which is actually, it's pretty common for folks that go into landscape architecture, they kind of discover it a little bit late in the game. And it was fairly early for me, fairly early speaking, as far as like going into my program and changing fairly early on. But what I wanted to do is discover like how I could have an even bigger impact on the environments that people use. And for me, landscape architecture is so broad and so public in nature a lot of the time that I was like, oh, this is going to have like a huge impact on, social justice from my point of view. And so when I thought about DeafSpace, when I discovered DeafSpace, it was probably like my last year of undergrad actually. And then I started writing about it in grad school. I really realized like, hey, this is how I bring about social justice for my particular community, and how it also just has so many positive implications for other groups of people as well. I tend to tell people, DeafSpace, DeafScape, and then also like universal design principles and other human-centered design principles are so powerful just because they start to consider different groups of people's needs that are often not studied deep enough in most design processes. And so when I started to think about DeafSpace, I was like, this is just another area of landscape architecture that is not being explored, right? So for me, I was just thinking about the streetscape in that graphic, in the sense that this is one of the most public spaces that people use on a daily basis, right? I mean, people might stop at a park or a plaza or in a building, but when you think about a streetscape, there's so many people passing through constantly all day long. So I just wanted to think about, how do you apply all of these principles to something that people use every day and so frequently in such mass quantities of people, right? So yeah, I was just thinking about that a little bit, and it really just started to grow from there. And now I also take it back down into smaller scale projects as well, like thinking about how do I kind of use this graphic to apply to like smaller parks or smaller plazas. And I've had people like, how do I apply DeafSpace to architecture? And then I'm like, well, you just have to go back to the DeafSpace principles. But it's all really related. You know, I think really all of those principles are just such good practices to make you know, myself feel more comfortable, and make Jeff and Chris and other deaf and hard of hearing folks feel more comfortable. And what it comes down to is just having more space to move, and more space to move through, like really busy spaces in particular, having comfort to communicate, just areas where you can kind of find a little bit of safety and like just general comfort, again, where like you can sit off of the main pathway, have open sight lines, all sorts of things come into play there. But yeah, generally just the largest scale I could think of was the streetscape, and that's how that kind of became DeafScape.
Yes, can I add to that, please?
Please.
So in terms of guidelines and what we have to do, so in the UK, there's not really any knowledge about deaf spaces and what we actually need. There's not enough information. The only thing that people really think about is installing a hearing loop in line with hearing aids. They don't think about where we need interpreters, what other setups we can have, what other design features we could incorporate. There's no other elements that are utilised, and that's what actually really needs to be changed. And, you know, perhaps thinking about what we need to do is creating a new role for perhaps, you know, consultants, where we can actually provide that information in regards to accessibility for deaf people in those then deaf spaces. So for example, the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, that's something that actually we need to make sure we provide that information to provide greater guidelines. And actually what people really need to realise is that these changes and amendments to guidelines would actually be beneficial to everybody, not just the deaf community. A lot of members of society who fit into different intersectionalities would actually benefit from some of these changes that are implemented.
Now, also in America, we have, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the standards that go along with that. And then also different states have different codes on top of that legalization. And I think that really like what happens with all of these standards and codes is people really apply them as an afterthought. And, you know, I'm sure Jeff can talk about this a bit more as well, but it's just like as an access specialist, I've been sort of backtracking and learning all about that code and standards a bit more than I did before, like more in depth. But I'm still finding that like I'm constantly wanting to go beyond those bare minimums, right? And I feel like DeafSpace is one opportunity to really do that. And obviously universal design in general as well. But I think the difference with DeafSpace is that it's so human-centered. It's really based off of a specific group's needs, and it was tested already by the deaf and hard of hearing community in many aspects of the research itself. Obviously, maybe not so much prototyping just yet, but a few buildings have been built with DeafSpace in mind, and they've been just proven to be successful for these groups of people. And so really just kind of continuing along that line of thinking where, like, you know, we can use universal design and human-centered principles that also bring in real lived experience to test it and to make sure that it's actually working for the people that are using the spaces. And I think that's what's really powerful about DeafSpace, is that it's already started to do that. So.
I think that's just something that we can all agree on is what really needs improvement if we want to become more inclusive. So thank you guys so much for speaking on that. So I think now we're going to pivot to student questions. We're first going to ask the audience if they have any questions. Otherwise, we do have questions that our ASL students sent in to us. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, we'd love to take them now.
Go around, maybe share like a favorite project or like most project.
So the question, oh, sorry, the question was whether each of the panelists might be willing to talk about one of the favorite projects they've worked on, maybe something that captures a lot of the work they're trying to do to support and advance the deaf and hard of hearing community?
Anyone?
I suppose I should start. I think it's probably difficult for me to pick a favourite because there isn't one that necessarily fits into myself as a deaf person. But the MAC, I would say, is where there are benefit concerts that are played and things. But it was the first venue that I went along to that deaf people could actually access, and I realised that actually it was just beautiful because we could actually access this performance. I think that's the only one so far that I can really think of.
Interesting. Jeff here. I'll jump in. There are several projects, so it's very difficult to pick one. One I'm currently working on with at the Mass Design Group and Gallaudet University is the Louise B. Miller Memorial. And this is at Gallaudet University on campus. This project came to be when the Black deaf community at Gallaudet University recognized the fact that they needed to do something to appropriately recognize the legacy of Louise B. Miller and her fight for access to higher education for Black deaf children. 2 years before Brown versus Board, the Board of Education. So this really speaks to the importance of community engagement and working with the communities, really researching and verifying and validating our understanding of deaf space through that process. We worked with students. We learned that the DeafSpace principles may not have a strong connection necessarily with the community there because it's not written with the Black deaf community on campus in mind. So there was a moment of aha and unpacking and trying to understand what was missing in the guidelines and how can we acknowledge and recognize the importance of the community on any project that we work with. How can we truly bring the community together to create a space for everyone in the community to jump on and co-create? Another project that I've really enjoyed working on is a project in Boise, Idaho, which is recognizing Castle, James Castle, an artist, a deaf artist, and a very prolific American artist in the western part of our country. It's a project that we're working to kind of reimagine how we bring deaf space perspective to James Castle's story, because the art world typically looks at his story through kind of the hearing gaze, a hearing lens. And so how we frame James Castle and his work is not told through the deaf lens. So we're trying to recreate and consider how do we best represent James Castle and his story and allow the visitor to experience what James Castle himself saw when he was there. So it's a special project because I would say both of them are special projects, but they're not just involving deaf space principles. At the same time, it takes them to the idea of the importance of honoring and uplifting a cultural memorial of somebody from the deaf community. So this is one of those, it goes beyond just, here's the guidelines and apply it to the space, right? Because it's the foundation of what we do, but it's truly about creating, a lighthouse, right? A moment there to show what's possible when we truly center around the community and their perspective.
And I can add to that as well. I often would sort of try to highlight that a lot of DeafSpace principles are just applied in a piecemeal way and often unknowingly in a lot of landscapes that I particularly love. So like there will be little bits and pieces of really good design elements that I benefit from, but it won't be like people won't know that they've done so, or that it'll just be like 1 or 2 or 3 DeafSpace principles in one place, right? Like for example, one garden that comes to mind with I used to work with Olin, and their main office is in Philadelphia. They designed the Getty gardens at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and part of that garden has some really like circular sort of like bowl-shaped elements, and it just really makes me feel sort of like enclosed and comfortable, right? But that's just like one example that kind of comes to mind, where we have like the circular elements, the circular shapes, degrees of enclosure, areas to really like step off of the main path that stand out to me. As far as projects that I've worked on, I'm currently working on a small project with Gallaudet University as well. It's very small though, and it's actually more from like a consulting role now. I brought that project to Olin when I was still there, and so they're the prime for landscape architecture, and I'm just providing some sort of like DeafSpace and universal design principles. So I'm kind of helping them just to like redo this plaza, but because it's on top of structure and the budget is so limited, it's been really hard to really break the ground there. But we're really thinking about like how can we apply DeafSpace principles in a really economical and like doable way, right? With all of these constraints that we have over parking structure that is like pretty old and has to be, basically a lot of the budget is going towards like fixing those structural issues that are happening with that parking structure. So yeah, we've just created more spaces to gather, more spaces to play, and more spaces where the deaf students can just be really comfortable and enjoy themselves, because that plaza is not being used really at all right now. So it's just something to think about, where we can sort of start to apply it from any phase of design, even if it's just sort of like a refresh of sorts. Because sometimes we don't get the privilege of starting over from scratch, right, in the design process. And you'll find that when you start working in architecture as well, sometimes you might not be able to start a building from scratch. You might have to just, you know, pick up where you can and try to refresh the project. And that's where you can really think about DeafSpace as well, though, even when it comes to something as simple as furnishings, and whether they be flexible or fixed, it makes a big difference in like lighting and planting and all sorts of things.
That was a wonderful summary, and I know you all do a lot of work, so I appreciate you doing your best to pick something for me. Do we have any other questions from the audience, please?
Also, if you're on the Zoom link, you can also send your questions into the chat if you're comfortable to do that.
I had a question, if our audience wants to be shy. Which is, you know, we've talked a little bit already. We've heard from, I think, all 3 of you about this challenge of kind of creating guidelines to kind of how we need to do better, how we need to do differently. And I was kind of curious to know whether there were aspects of DeafSpace, of DeafScape, that you already see kind of moving more and more into the mainstream, whether there are positive indicators of what may still be yet to come. That you see that we can rally behind, or that you can shed some light on that might not be so apparent to the rest of us.
Well, this is Jeff here. Oh, Alexa. Okay, I'll go. This is Jeff. I'll jump in. So I think that we work to think about how DeafSpace and disability justice is foundational to a lot of work that we do. And also how deaf and disabled communities overlap in a variety of ways. At the same time, you know, they're the same and they overlap. So we use this sort of a frame to better understand accessibility. What does it mean to be accessible? Who capitalizes and uses accessibility, and access to what? It's not just about making accessibility for deaf and disabled, it's for everyone, the rest of the groups, oppressed groups, marginalized groups, LGBTQIA groups. there's so many different there's many stakeholders that need access, and it's foundational for the universe, for everyone. And that's where I see the potential for DeafSpace and disability justice to have a universal impact on the ideal of accessibility, the idea of being a liberatory, if you will, liberating spaces where people feel like they can come into, they belong, there's a sense of belonging, a sense of community, there's a dialogue, there's a comfort. At the same time, they feel acknowledged, they feel seen. I think there's one thing I mentioned earlier, that currently we're starting to see more and more projects that highlight and honor deaf and disabled spaces. That is, I think we'll see more of that. That's my projection. We'll see more of that come into play over the next coming years. It's exciting to see this happen because this gives our community spaces where we feel seen. Also giving people spaces to connect and belong and identify. So I think that is really a powerful thing to really think about, is that potential.
Alexa, to build off that, I know you had a moment to think there. Are there spaces you can point to? Are there architects you can point to? Are there particular mechanisms that you see coming more and more into the mainstream that you feel really capture those sentiments, capture those objectives?
Yeah, I think it's been more so people have just been really open to concepts of access and universal design. I've been seeing that universal design in particular has really been like a buzzword the past few years. And I think it's definitely a positive thing to see. I think that folks are a little bit unclear about exactly what it means to design universal design. And I think that is something that is just continuing to grow education-wise. I think that people really do have really good intentions as well
Alexa,
about
I'm
as far
so
as like
sorry.
wanting to learn
Would you
more.
hold on for just a
There
second?
are folks that have reached out to me and asked me questions. Oh,
Sorry, just bear with us a second. Could you go back? Sorry, we'll just wait because Robert just did freeze. He's back now. Bear with us a second, sorry.
I'm so sorry to cut you off, Alexa. Please continue.
Okay, yeah. So I was just going to say that I think that people have really good intentions about creating access. I was frozen again. Okay, yeah. Good intentions. Sorry, I'm saying that again. They have good intentions about universal design and designing access. I think that there is just this lack of understanding that it's necessary to bring disabled and deaf folks into the process in order to really successfully implement accessible design, right, in a universal way. But I think that in general, people are just starting to ask the right questions and start to realize that, like, I try to educate people about the fact that universal design is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's just meant to try to fit more needs than we currently do, right? And then we still need to bring in that direct stakeholder feedback that Jeff was talking about in order to really make sure that it happens successfully and meaningfully and with the right voices at the table. But I think also as far as like DeafSpace, I've had a lot of students actually starting to implement DeafSpace a little bit in their work. They've kind of just they've been making little presentations or applying to their studio projects. And I think that that's really just, it makes me feel happy to see that happening with students, because I think a lot of folks that are students now, yourselves included, are really going to start, you know, making that change happen at a broader scale than it is now. Because if you start in the studio, if you start at school and you start thinking about all of these concepts and all of these different groups that you're designing for, and then you start to just, you know, implement those concepts when you start working, it just becomes more like second nature. And I think that's really what's going to shift the profession in a better direction, because, you know, we have a lot of younger folks entering the workforce now, and it's really great to see that all of these shifts are happening all across the social spectrum, like not just with DeafSpace, but with, you know, access in general, with all the other cultural groups that Jeff mentioned, BIPOC groups, LGBTQ groups. Like, everybody really benefits from a lot of this just social justice line of thinking, because design, I think, is really all about social justice. I think it's just so powerful. It's a way to really bring people together and to really make sure that we're listening to different people's needs. So that's the way to do that, like really to think about all of these principles in ways that we can create those spaces.
Absolutely. I think that's made particularly well. I'll say first.
Sorry, Emmett, to cut you off. Could I come in there slightly? I just wanted to add to Alexa and Jeff's point before we continue. I just wanted to talk about my experience in the UK. So, for example, talking about DeafSpace and talking about what we want to do is I want to create a space called DAF, Deaf Architecture Front. So what we want to do is try to create a safe space and also create a petition of people who will support the fact that these changes need to be implemented, so that we need these guidelines in place. And what I want to do is take that petition to the RIBA to make sure that we then get their support and it actually is implemented in policy. But thinking about DeafSpace, I think hearing people really have started to learn a little bit about deaf spaces, but by giving them specific tasks, it means that they can start to learn what it actually feels like and to build confidence in creating deaf spaces. So perhaps bringing in a deaf architectural consultant to talk through floor plans and future planning would help to build that confidence for hearing individuals who don't necessarily have the experience or the knowledge. But also just, not having to make the choice between making a space accessible architecturally and beautiful, but also accessible to the deaf community, but being able to combine the two. But I think what we really want to do is get those names in and create this petition and get the RIBA to support these changes in guideline and policy here in the UK, which we just don't have at the moment.
So Chris, thank you for adding that. I was going to throw to you, but I wasn't going to ask you about that. So I'm glad you jumped in. It occurs to me that while I think all three of you are in so many ways kind of engaged with the needs of the deaf community and the larger community with disabilities. Chris, you in particular are through the work you're doing, building the tools, building the building blocks to support this kind of growth, to support this kind of I don't know, kind of mobilization of young people, of engaged people, of interested people. And clearly there's a legislative side to that as well, which, forgive me, I'm over across the pond. I'm not as well as acquainted with as you are. But do you find, as Alexa was speaking to, that there is the widespread support, that there is the interest, that there are the people there excited about doing that work? And if you do, kind of where is that coming from?
Yes.
Do you mean legally? So
No, I meant well, sure, legally.
Well, in the UK, I think, to be honest, our guidelines here just only focus on providing hearing loops for hearing aid users, which isn't obviously useful. So they forget about the spatial awareness to make sure that we have enough space to have those conversations in sign language, to make sure that we can bring interpreters into a space. And unfortunately, it just means that deaf people have to, grin and bear it. We have to tolerate these spaces, the restrictions that they place upon us. Unfortunately, what we don't have are deaf people who are always included in that design process. And it does obviously impact the deaf community. So, for example, if I go to the theatre, the interpreter is oftentimes just placed at the side of the stage and it's quite far from where I'm sitting. There's very poor lighting. So it just means that I have very poor visibility and therefore poor access. So I think, to be honest, what I'd like to do is create a new role in practice of an architectural consultant who can then obviously teach people about what they need to consider. Additionally, we have very few deaf architects here in the UK. So actually, if we were going to resolve those issues, how would we actually do that physically? So we have to think about that too. In terms of legality, I think recently in the UK, hopefully you're aware that we had the BSL bill it's going through Parliament at the moment. So what we are hoping for is that it gets legal recognition. But of course, that will be such a long process, and it's quite sad for the UK, but we have to carry on fighting the good fight and make sure that we get the access that we need. One thing that I would like to do is, we have public consultations, of course, as you know, but what we don't have is accessibility for deaf people to those public consultations. So everything is in written English, for example. There are no BSL translated videos provided. So deaf people don't have access to the content of the consultations in order to sign up to attend these consultative conversations. So it just means that we have to resolve these accessibility issues first, enable to build that confidence within the deaf community so that they know that they have the ability to book an interpreter. It will be paid for, it will be supplied. And it just means that then if we iron out those issues, deaf people will be able to be involved in the creative process going forward.
This is Jeff here. I'd like to just maybe add in, just quickly respond to the question from Emmett and building on what Chris has just pointed out. There's one very unique thing that I'm really starting to just see more and more. It's agencies in the US are really beginning to invest resources to highlight deaf and disabled histories, including, for example, the City of Boise Department of Arts and History, who is running and facilitating the James Castle House. The National Park Service, NPS has expanded programming to highlight and focus on disability spaces. The history of a significance. It's starting to grow. However, I want to really pinpoint on something that Christopher just commented on. It's the idea of making access. We have to think about what are the preconditions we have to create rich, radical accessibility in our profession. We need to have interpreters. We need to have language. We need to have access captioning. We need to have compliance. We need to have better best practices, codes, guidelines, etc., in order to be able to create and shape liberation and liberatory spaces. I would also like to point to what is happening in architecture as a field more broadly. I've thought about this. There's really this, in the 2000s, there was this idea of, star architecture, this idea of promoting by this culture, mass media, social media, this architecture, it's very, very visible. It's very set. It's very much a formal, universal kind of a design. It's a formal gymnastics kind of design. There's just gymnastics of it all. And this image and culture is really just one sensory experience. What DeafSpace and disability design does, it approaches design from multiple sensory perspectives: vision, tactile, sound, scent. The multi-sensory experience really helps to create a multi-sensory space. And that is foundational to architecture. That is something that deaf and disabled communities, are so need to roll up our sleeves and get into. I want to also be able to acknowledge the importance and the need for guidelines and best practices. And a framework is important, of course, but I don't want to see deaf and disabled designers just pigeonholed in consultants' roles. I want to see the opportunity for deaf and disabled designers to roll up their sleeves and get into the process and work in this craft and work on a project that is seminal, from either small to large in scale. But there's this multi-sensory totality of experience is something we want to see. It's this knowledge that needs to be brought to bear and represented, rather than just having support consultative roles. I want to see a much larger role for deaf and disabled designers and architects. That's my hope for our future lineage and generations.
I wanted to add to that as well, just from the legal standpoint. So, good. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I think as far as the ADA is concerned and state code is concerned, it's obviously not something that we can just throw out. It's very important, obviously, in achieving, baseline access minimum. But I think, as Jeff was saying, the important thing is to really get more deaf and disabled designers, architects, planners, landscape architects, joining all of these fields, because what I find each time I interact with other deaf and disabled folks is that our lived experience just really does inform the way that we understand and use space. And every time I speak to different people about it, we just find that this minimum is not enough space for like a wheelchair to pass through, or like a neurodivergent person is not getting a sense of comfort at all from these standards, right? In like a really busy space, or like for the deaf community, for example, I know that Chris was mentioning assistive listening devices in the UK. So like when it comes to the ADA, the deaf community is really like not like represented at all in the ADA standards or even in state codes, other than technological implications. So it really just, it's really just the assistive listening devices. And then there's like flashing fire alarms to put inside of buildings, like the strobe light flashing fire alarms. And then there's also TTY phones, which are like super archaic now. Actually, like nobody uses those as much because we have video phones, we have texting, we have email, we have video interpretation, which you see here today. And so I think it was really important to just sort of highlight that, because yes, we do have to follow these bare minimums in order to get any type of baseline access, but people are still grumbling at even applying these baseline minimums to their designs, right? Oftentimes it's an afterthought, and it's really not that much to apply. I mean, they really are the bare minimums or maximums when it comes to certain elements, but as far as like, minimum widths for pathways, or like minimum amount of entrances that are accessible, or different things like that, it's really not asking much, and people are grumbling about that already. And so I think when we bring in disabled and deaf folks into our practice, it will just start to become more apparent, because we'll be able to point out, this doesn't actually fit my needs. I'm not actually represented by this guideline. We need to go beyond those. And it's the same, for the autistic and neurodivergent community as well. And folks with cognitive and mental disabilities just not being represented at all by our legislation when it comes to design. So yeah, the design standards are really important to really treat as that baseline minimum, but it's not actually representing a group such as ours very well. So I just think it's important to note that, the legislation does come into play for different groups of disabled folks, like folks who use wheelchairs, and physically disabled and mobility disabled folks who are either ambulatory wheelchair users or full-time wheelchair users, or using other types of adaptive tools or not. Those guidelines are very important to me as a bare minimum. But again, I'm not seeing too much representation for somebody like me who's going to be using like a public streetscape or a public space in general. But yeah, it's just something I try to highlight a little bit, because the work I'm doing now is so based on the ADA, and I'm still finding that it's lacking in some cases. But I don't want to sort of like, downplay the importance of those guidelines for other groups of people to even get any type of access to any space. You know what I mean? So it's a balance there, but I think we can always go beyond what's in that document.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all your guys' answers and being able to chime in.
Sorry, Madison, can I just jump in very, very quickly? I'm sorry. So just talking about representation there, as we've said, there's not enough deaf representation, but it's really, really difficult to become a qualified architect in the UK. There are multiple barriers that we experience. So for example, here in England, there are 3 stages. So to become a qualified architect, there are 3 stages. So in part 3, you have to do a written exam. It's not really accessible for sign language users. So that obviously needs to be adjusted. But in terms of people starting the journey, they lose confidence and they give up. There's also very few deaf role models in the field at the moment. That's a huge problem that we have at the moment. And I think actually, if we were to remove that barrier of inaccessibility, it would hopefully grow our pool of deaf architects here, because it's a real struggle, even just to get qualified. And I think just for myself, I only had ever met a white deaf architect, but actually I had never met a black deaf architect. And so we also have to think about intersectionality and how that plays into people's aspirations. You know, and I think hopefully in the future we'll be able to have different projects, but we'll have a greater range of role models too for the deaf community.
Thank you so much for also chiming in to talk about intersectionality. We really appreciate that. That's a big part of our ASL curriculum. So I'm really glad that you were able to touch upon that. So yeah, I wanted to thank you all for the past hour answering all of our questions. We don't want to keep you here any longer than we have scheduled for. We know that you're very hardworking and busy people. So thank you all so much for making the time. If you guys have any closing statements that you would like to make or any advice for our ASL students or architecture students, yeah, that would be the time. Thank you again.
No, I would say.
Oh, I was just gonna say, this is Jeff. Architect and education is going through significant change right now. And we are seeing more and more encounters in the design process itself, right? And it being a challenge, challenging how we approach the process. I think that's something, you know, it depends on who we bring to the table and who we include in the room. Who are we leaving out of the room? So that would be something I would encourage each and every one of you as you learn ASL or continue your architectural path, how the process itself and who is and is not being represented. Is there a barrier to seeing additional representation like Chris just mentioned? How can we utilize the tools we have, the resources we have to break down those barriers in order to create a stronger and more collaborative and accessible profession? And I think, you know, that's something that's, you know, hugely important as we think about accessibility. You know, we think about it in terms of codes and legal responsibilities and those minimum requirements. Yes, those are important, but also it leads to risk averse, right? That whole mindset. And we have to acknowledge the importance of addressing and making sure that the accessibility is provided. But again, I think you want to go above and beyond the bare minimums. To Alexa's point, how do we create the space that allows for maximum interaction, maximum engagement, community partnerships, and ideally, you know, this student group, you know, as you progress your learning in ASL and architecture, we depend on you to take that to the next level.
Yeah, and I would second that. And I think really as students, you have a lot of power right now to really form your thinking into, you know, you're branching out into different professions. And I would say even from a landscape architecture perspective, you know, going to school at Berkeley, we had a really rich history of all of the civil rights movements with the disability rights movement and everything throughout the Bay Area, but there wasn't a curriculum built for the type of classes that I wanted to take in accessibility and universal design and human-centered design. And I know that that's the case across the country and probably even in the UK and other countries as well. And I would just encourage you to take the time to study all sorts of different social justice related design topics that you're interested in, because if you don't take the time, it might get lost on the way, you know. And I think it's really a conscious choice to start to study those things, even when it's not provided for us in our curriculum. And I would say when you're looking into work like that, make sure that you're referencing experts that are not only experts, but also have the lived experience to share as well, because it will really make a huge difference in coming to a better understanding of what it means to, you know, not only know how to design for a certain group of people, but also know how to live that type of life and that experience that type of design is designing for, right? So yeah, that would really be my 2 cents, is just to make the time and then really start to study people that are experts with the lived experience.
Yes, sorry, this is my very last point. I'm so sorry. Yes, so I would also just like to add the concept of funding and the limitations that that can provide. So, for example, if somebody deaf wants to work within an architectural practice, you know, there's always the question about who will fund the interpreters for that working week. So if they don't have that funding, it means that that's an additional barrier that they have to face. So it's about, you know, how do these students then also have the opportunities to gain experience? So like I was saying before as well, public consultations, who books the interpreters, who funds the interpreters? There is no agreement in place with local authorities or local councils. So it just means that, you know, funding is also an additional barrier that needs to be resolved. Once you have the funding in place, it means that it's one less barrier to face and we can overcome it in a much easier way. I think that I'll stop there.
Okay, well, I appreciate you all providing some closing remarks. It's nice to know there's still hope and certainly some sentiments that can carry forth, not just for us architecture students, but for I think so many of us in different fields. It has really been such a pleasure, tech issues aside, to have you all here. So thank you so much for coming on Zoom. Thank you so much, Jeff, for coming here in person. We're so honored to have had such an accomplished group of panelists come speak to a bunch of students who are in their second or third or fourth semester of learning ASL. So it's really been a pleasure. And I think we have some architecture students, both undergraduate and graduate students on the Zoom call as well. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It's really been a pleasure. And we wish you all the best. Thanks so much.
Thank you guys so much for coming and taking the time out of your days to come talk to our students. Thank you to our lovely tech team who had to go through a lot. Thank you to our interpreters. You guys really helped us make this all run so smoothly, and it turned out amazing. So thank you guys for coming. We really do appreciate it, and we will be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Till next time. We'll all be in person, maybe.
I hope so.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Pleasure working with you guys. Thank you very
Likewise.
much. Take care.
Thanks.